It was a Friday night. The rain was falling at a steady pace and the sky was plunged into the darkness of night. Emma had just finished her shift at a restaurant and was exhausted. She longed for her bed and the comfort of her cozy apartment. Knowing that walking in the pouring rain was impractical, she decided to call an Uber. With a tap on the app, she saw the approaching black car icon on her map. The driver, whose name was Richard, was just a few minutes away. Emma grabbed her backpack, straightened her coat, and went out to the front of the restaurant to wait. The rain was falling heavily on her, leaving her drenched in a matter of seconds. Finally, a black luxury car stopped in front of her, and the power window rolled down to reveal the driver. Richard was a middle-aged man with gray hair and a friendly smile on his face. "Good evening, Emma. Where can I take you?" he asked gently. "Hello, Richard. Please take me to 43 Oakwood Street," replied Emma, still shivering slightly from the freezing rain that had drenched her. "Sure, no problem. Come in and make yourself comfortable," Richard said as he opened the car door for her. Emma got into the vehicle and got into the back seat. The interior of the car was warm and comfortable, which was a welcome relief after exposure to the storm. She let out a sigh of relief as she closed the door. The trip began smoothly, with Richard expertly driving the car through the city's sodden streets. The rain was hitting the windshield hard, creating a constant drumming sound. Emma was relieved to be safe from the storm and hoped to get home soon. As the journey continued, she couldn't help but notice that the driver seemed particularly quiet. He didn't ask the usual questions a ride-hailing driver would ask, like about his day or his journey. Richard drove with concentration, looking at the road and avoiding eye contact in the rearview mirror. At first, Emma didn't think much of it. Some drivers were more reserved than others, and she was too tired to hold a conversation that night. However, a strange feeling began to grow within her. She felt like she was being watched. She glanced in the rearview mirror and found Richard's eyes fixed on her. His friendly smile was gone, replaced by a cold, unsettling expression. Emma felt immediately uncomfortable. "Everything is fine?" she asked nervously, trying to dispel the feeling of tension that had settled in the car. Richard didn't respond immediately. He just kept looking at her, his expression increasingly sinister. It was then that Emma realized that he was taking a completely different route than the one he usually took to get home. His heart started to beat faster, and fear began to set in. She tried calling the Uber app to track the route, but her phone had no signal. She was completely at the mercy of Richard and the direction he was taking. The feeling of panic rose within her as she realized she was being taken to an unfamiliar place and far from her usual route. Emma couldn't think of a reasonable explanation for this change of route. She struggled to remain calm, but the tension in the car was palpable. What was Richard planning? Where was he taking her? As the car drove down unfamiliar streets, Emma's mind began to panic. She knew she needed to find a way to escape this terrifying situation, but she had no idea how to do it. Richard continued to drive with a sinister expression, and Emma was increasingly convinced that something terrible was about to happen. Her heart was beating wildly, and she could feel drops of cold sweat running down her face. However, she could not allow fear to paralyze her. She needed to act and act quickly. As she watched the driver, she discreetly looked for anything she could use as a weapon or means of defense. His eyes finally landed on a flashlight in the front seat of the car. With her heart in her mouth, Emma waited for the right moment. She knew she had to choose her moment carefully, as any rash move could be dangerous. The car continued to move away from the urban area, entering increasingly isolated secondary roads. Finally, the opportunity arose. The car passed a particularly dark and deserted stretch of road, and Emma grabbed the flashlight with determination. She turned it on, shining the light directly into Richard's eyes, catching him off guard. The driver screamed and closed his eyes, momentarily blinded by the sudden light. Emma wasted no time. With all the strength she could muster, she opened the car door and jumped out. The impact left her stunned, but adrenaline propelled her to get up quickly. Richard stopped the car in front, getting out angrily and advancing towards her. The rain continued to fall mercilessly, making Emma's escape even more difficult. She ran as fast as she could, her breathing heavy and ragged with fear. As she ran, Emma managed to spot a gas station in the distance. She knew it was her only hope of escaping the predator that was after her. Every step was a fight against panic and exhaustion, but she knew she couldn't stop. Finally, he arrived at the gas station, where he saw some customers inside the establishment. She ran inside and begged for help, telling the terrifying story of what had happened in the Uber. Gas station employees immediately called the police and kept Emma safe while they waited for authorities to arrive. As she waited, Emma couldn't stop shaking. The memory of Richard's sinister gaze was still fresh in her mind, and she feared that he might appear at any moment to exact revenge. Finally, when the police arrived, she could breathe a sigh of relief. She told them everything that happened, providing a detailed description of Richard and the car. Officers immediately set out to search for the driver, using information provided by Emma. When the police finally found him, Richard tried to flee, but was detained and handcuffed. Emma's terrifying night trip had come to an end, but the trauma she suffered would stay with her forever. Richard's arrest brought temporary relief to Emma's mind, but it also left deep scars. She needed years of therapy to deal with the trauma she had experienced. Even when she tried to move on, the images of that night tormented her. What she didn't know was that Richard's arrest would reveal something even more sinister, something that extended far beyond her own experience. Emma's terrifying journey was just the beginning of a much larger nightmare, one that would affect many others and cast a permanent shadow over the community. Richard's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. The news that an Uber driver was involved in an attempted kidnapping and possible assault shocked everyone. However, what no one could imagine at that time was that Richard's arrest would reveal something even more sinister. As the investigation progressed, police searched Richard's car for additional evidence. What they found horrified everyone. In the trunk of the vehicle, there was a collection of sharp knives, ropes, and tape. It was a macabre discovery that suggested much darker intentions than a simple kidnapping attempt. As the news spread, other passengers who had had terrifying encounters with Richard began to come forward. His stories were chilling and revealed a pattern of threatening behavior that he had kept hidden for too long. Many other victims shared similar experiences of being targeted by his unhealthy obsession. Richard's name soon became synonymous with the city's nightmare, and people began to question his safety when using ride-sharing services. Transportation apps, including Uber, have come under heavy scrutiny, and customers have become wary of hailing a car, even when necessary. As the horror stories multiplied, the community began to recognize that Richard was part of a shadowy network of criminals. The investigation revealed that he was part of a circle of app drivers who used their jobs to approach potential victims. Many of them had criminal records and were believed to be involved in violent crimes such as robberies and assaults. The victims' stories were chilling. Some passengers had been targets of sexual harassment, while others reported attempted kidnapping and physical assault. The community was shocked to discover that many of these stories had not been reported to authorities, in part due to fear of retaliation from drivers or a lack of solid evidence. As the dark truth about Richard and his circle of criminals unfolded, the community began to demand stronger action from ride-sharing companies and law enforcement. Companies responded by implementing additional safety measures, such as stricter background checks for drivers and enhancing trip tracking options for passengers. Richard's arrest also led to greater awareness about safety when using ride-hailing apps. People started to be more cautious and share their stories and experiences to warn others. The community came together to ensure that the horror stories shared by Emma and other victims served as a stark warning to everyone. Emma's terrifying journey and Richard's arrest echoed as a constant reminder that evil can lurk in the most ordinary situations of everyday life. Emma's experience and Richard's arrest marked a turning point in the community, reminding everyone that personal safety is a non-negotiable priority in a world filled with unexpected dangers. With Richard's conviction, the community finally began to breathe a sigh of relief. Life in prison ensured he would never be a threat again, but the victims' emotional scars persisted. The nightmares they had experienced continued to haunt them, and the feeling of vulnerability never completely disappeared. Emma has become an active advocate for safety awareness when using ride-hailing apps. She shared her story at local events, in schools, and online, encouraging people to be more vigilant when using these services. She wanted to make sure other people didn't go through the horror she faced that night. The entire city was on alert after Richard's arrest. Ride-hailing companies have been pressured to implement stricter safety measures, including more thorough background checks for drivers. Passengers now had additional options to stay safe while traveling, such as the ability to share route information with friends and family. Emma's story and Richard's arrest spread beyond the city, serving as a wake-up call for people across the country. Many have begun adopting strict safety practices when using ride-hailing services, such as verifying driver information and sharing trip details with others. The horror stories of Emma and the other victims became a constant reminder that personal safety was a non-negotiable priority. As the community recovered and scrambled to protect itself, Richard's trial began. He faced a series of charges, including attempted kidnapping, threats, and assault. The revelation of his involvement in a criminal ring made his case even more notorious. The trial was closely watched by concerned residents, especially the victims who waited for justice. Richard's conviction was a relief for everyone, but it would not erase what he had done. He was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring that he would never again be a threat to society. However, even with Richard's arrest, the victims' emotional scars persisted. Many faced deep trauma and struggled to overcome the fear and distrust that this experience had left in their lives. Emma's story, which began that rainy night in an Uber, served as a constant reminder that evil can lurk in the most common situations of everyday life. She became a symbol of resilience and strength as the community learned to be more vigilant and come together to protect each other. The horror stories that emerged from that terrifying night and Richard's arrest continued to haunt the city, but they also encouraged people to take steps to protect themselves. The nightmare had come to an end, but the determination to never allow anything similar to happen again was more alive than ever. The community was stronger, more vigilant, and determined to keep safety a top priority in their lives. And so, this haunting story became a constant reminder that unity and resilience can overcome even the darkest nightmares,